Hello, it is Neil Ramat from AU, and welcome to another feed forum. And today we're going to be talking about distributed production or remote production, as you may have also heard it called, or as you probably may have called it in the pandemic, just a Zoom call. Um, there were all kinds of tools for digital or distributed production, remote production, sitting around for ages. People talked about this possibility of like, you could just do a lot of the stuff remotely. You wouldn't have to like fly everybody out to do things on location. You could have somebody doing something through a browser, at a completely different location, maybe sitting at home in their living room. And those things were kind of just sitting around, kind of being used, sort of experimented with. Then the pandemic came, the height of the pandemic in most industries, and certainly the broadcast industry had to rethink what they were doing like by Monday, like immediately. And so luckily, a lot of these tools were lying around and people just started sticking stuff together to see if it worked. And some of it worked. A lot of it worked. Surprisingly, I think a lot of us found, and no matter what industry we were in, that a lot of these remote tools and online tools work really well. Remote production as we know it really got a kickoff during the pandemic. We're going to talk today about what happened after that, where we are with remote and distributed production and live, what that really means, and what tools are available that we can use in the future, and how those can be democratized and used for anybody doing any kind of production. So I'd like to thank my guests. If you guys would introduce yourselves, I got Ian Wagdin and Sergio Ammirata. Sergio, tell us quickly who you are. Let's get into this conversation.
I am Sergio Ammirata. I'm the chief scientist of SIB Radius. And today I'm here on behalf of the Rist Forum. I'm one of the directors as well. It's an open standards organization that manages the marketing of the Rist protocol. One of the ones that was born for remote production, so to speak.
Amazing. And Ian?
Yeah, hi, Ian Wagdin. I'm VP of Technology and Innovation at Appear, and we make encoders and decoders that a lot of people are using to enable remote production workflows right across the globe.
So both of you guys were people working on, as we were saying, these technologies that were just chugging away, being built by people like you. So that when somebody decided, oh, we need some alternative, the alternative was kind of ready to go. I guess looking at the pandemic, we kind of point to the pandemic as like sort of a turning point for when people really accepted the idea that you could do production, browser-based production, if you will, or remote production, distributed production, that was a real thing that you could do. And don't freak out; it's actually a thing you can do. How would you say things have progressed in that time? I've heard people say that people kind of in the couple of years since, or a few years since, people have gone back to location production, kind of abandoned remote production as a thing, or that has kind of changed in ways that people hadn't expected. What is your take on like where we've come over the past, say, 5 years?
Well, I think that there are two separate, uh, you know, topics we should cover on that question. Technologically speaking, where have things gone, and business speaking, right? What have companies actually done or not done, and how the two have influenced each other, right? Because one of the things that I want to elaborate on, one of the things you said is literally people were sticking stuff together, right? During the pandemic. The pandemic broke all the rules. All the organization, large and small, they threw the rule book out the window. All the checks and balances, this is broadcast, or this is that, I can only use this type of format or technology, all went out the window during the pandemic. So with that fresh mind, with that open mind, there were a lot of holes that were filled by different types of solutions. Some very good, some not very good, but they worked to some extent. And then what happens after that, right? The pandemic is over. Okay, now let's calm down. Let's put now the rules back in. But the rules don't fit what they were doing. So what happened next? That's a good topic to cover from a technological point of view and from the business point of view. What did the customers do? What did the broadcasters do? What did the vendors do after that? To catch up. Vendors like, Ian or other encoder manufacturers have, some of them missed the boat because they were not agile enough during the pandemic. Me in particular, Cypratus was the other company that I have, pretty nimble. So we're able to adapt, and we scored some gigantic points in the broadcasting industry. And now we're very well known there. But that was all thanks to the pandemic, right? And then there's the organizations that were writing standards. I realized, okay, we need to fill in this gap. How do we do it? What are the protocols that we should be using? So I think that we should elaborate, on all those different aspects of what happened after the pandemic.
I'll talk a little bit to the kind of technology side and actually how the technology side has changed, because I think when we went into that there was a big panic, and there were all sorts of solutions, as Sergio says. Sort of, you could either have a piece of hardware on location that you remote controlled, or you could try and run a virtual machine somewhere and then control that centrally. And I think what it did was it opened people's eyes to actually we can work in this way, but we haven't really got the ideal technology stack in order to enable that. And then since the pandemic, we've really started to think about how we architect our technologies so that we give people options, and we give those editorial teams choices, whether they want to be on location or whether they want to be working remotely. And we know that. I mean, long before the pandemic, we saw big broadcasters sort of working around things like the Olympics and stuff like that, where it was getting expensive to fly whole big teams out and do that stuff. So how do you bring back world feeds and maybe have, logging teams or certain teams not out on location? And then it's just really the balance of how many people you send versus how many people you keep at base. And I think that's what's changed is the technology enablers and the way that we're thinking in order to deliver that.
That's really interesting that that there are those tensions, that technology and business tension, and even in the business tension of, we've made some investment, we're going to do things this way, but then the other side going, oh wow, I hadn't even really realized we could change this and save a whole bunch of money immediately. And yeah, I wonder what are your experience, especially as a vendor, maybe Ian, like what's that been like, that kind of push and pull of like, we've made an investment, but if we could make a leap forward suddenly, that would save us a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, in my previous role, I was actually on working for a large broadcaster, and we saw that the reality is when you speak to sort of editorial people on the ground, the point was they always wanted to be there. They wanted to feel they were part of the action. And I think what the pandemic proved was actually that didn't need to happen, and then they could still produce a high quality product, perhaps without having that, all the editorial teams meeting for breakfast and having a chat and all that. That just happened in the Zoom calls and the stuff like that. So people just found new ways of working, and it also enabled a whole bunch of new talent to come in as well. So people who perhaps couldn't travel or didn't want to travel. So we've increased our sort of diversity in roles. There's a lot of people changes that go alongside just the fundamental editorial changes. And in a world where people don't want to fly or don't want to be away, if you're looking at World Cup and Olympics, you can be away from home for a month, sometimes longer, 6 weeks by the time you've done the setup, the event itself, the tear down. I think the World Cup's actually 2 months, all in all. So it's a big commitment from staff. And young people and the talent that we want to bring into the industry are kind of a little bit more, well, actually, I need a life outside of my work environment. So it enables us to meet some of those demands as well.
So I guess looking at the moving away from the pandemic, which we looked at as kind of was sort of where there was a revolution, or at least a push towards a revolution in how we did content. Now remote production seems to be, in everybody's toolkit. And I'm wondering kind of what your take is on how it's being incorporated and kind of what the upsides are, really. I know, Ian, you mentioned obviously the ability to be able to stay at home, which is a big deal for people wanting to have a life outside of their broadcast job. But there do seem to be a lot of upsides. So can you maybe get into some of those?
Do you want me to start on that?
Yeah.
So obviously there's a sustainability aspect, which means we're not shipping kit, across continents, across the world, across countries, however that is. If we can sort of send less kit on location, that's got to be good for the planet. The ability to do more than one event with a capital investment on your hardware control surfaces and things like that's quite a lot important to some people. You might be able to cover 2 or 3 events with one gallery rather than effectively what we were doing before, which is kind of shifting the gallery around to where the events take place. The flip side of that is we're more reliant on connectivity than we ever have been. But connectivity is more ubiquitous now. It's better, it's faster, there's more of it. So a lot of people are starting to realize that actually the balance there has kind of flipped. And so, with reliable connectivity, with the tools that are now available, with the people who are more used to working in that way, it feels like it's becoming more real all the time.
Sergio, do you want to chime in on that?
Yes, I mean, from a standards point of view, we've evolved into kind of a mess of REMI, where there's 50 different ways of doing things, and they don't talk to each other. And most of them are, company specific or vendor specific. And even though there are standards that allow you to do all the different pieces, those standards have not evolved fast enough to have an orchestration layer that can stitch them all together. And it's a big problem right now because somebody that wants to start or get into this REMI production mode, we don't know where to start. We don't know if to pay a fortune to company A or to try to use their team to stitch everything together with open source or open standards, or something in between. So even the companies that embraced it, during the pandemic and it worked, have gone back and said, okay, how do we do it better? How do we do it more reliably with more security? And at the beginning, security was thrown out the window. Just make it work, right? And now that they have to put it in, how do they do it? That's where we stand right now in this wild west of remote production. It works. Some solutions are more secure than others. Some are more reliable than others. Some recover better from packet loss or from poor connectivity. And then, people are confused. So you talk to 5 companies. Some of them will tell you it doesn't work. The technology is not there. Others swear by it and say we do everything, on a REMI based.
I think it's interesting that actually, on that standards thing, there are several different ways of doing this. Yeah. So I know several companies here in the UK who have SDI based infrastructure and they make that work remotely. We also know that the IP stuff and the transport layer stuff and the 2110, the JPEG-X's, that all works. But as we now move into cloud, we need to start thinking about actually those compute, the data transport, and we're just starting on that journey now with work we're doing with the dynamic media facility, kind of identifying how data moves around between applications, between vendors, between different hosts, cloud solutions, and so we've really got these kind of 3 models of which there's a hybrid. You can either do it in a kind of digital way with SDI, you can do it in an IP based way, using 2110 or equivalents. NDI is obviously another one that some people use for this. And then when we move into software and the cloud, there's a completely different architecture in that space as well. So people really have to think about actually what does my end-to-end workflow look like. And one thing about standards, I think we're quite guilty at just looking at one part of the workflow rather than looking at the whole solution. And that's perhaps what we need to do as an industry, is just take a step back and go, actually, the whole end-to-end ecosystem looks like this, right the way from the lens of the camera, right the way through to the piece of glass that people are watching it on.
Because it is, yeah, it's like, so are there any like best practices established? Because you have that in the same way, I guess, that when people were pushed into doing stuff from the pandemic, as you had mentioned, it was like, well, I guess it's going to be Skype or Zoom or whatever that we're going to do this live broadcast that normally we would have brought cameras in. And so I mean, I don't like the word, but some of these processes have become democratized, if that's a word, where a lot of people have access to them. a lot of different parts of the sector outside of traditional broadcast start to have access to them and develop their own ways of doing things. Or if I'm a brand, or if I'm a sports league or whatever, I might be able to grab these tools and just go running with them. But it seems like you might have people scattering in all different directions, finding what works for them or what doesn't work for them. They may be wondering, how do I make this thing work, and have no idea. So is it possible to develop best practices, or is everybody going to have to just sort of sort out their own particular use case themselves?
I think it is. I think there's some great work going on. I mentioned the dynamic media facilities, the EBU, around defining that. But I think we've got certain challenges. So one thing is production moves fast. Yeah. So every single time there's a new production, somebody wants to try something new, somebody wants to do something new. So the pace of change in that environment, and that could be driven by an editorial reason, could be driven by the technology availability, could be driven by a technology availability that's suddenly come out. So we'll see iteration upon iteration upon iteration of these kind of working ways. And every time you take that step, you might evolve into the next step of the chain. And we'll see that accelerate as we move to software, because you're no longer constrained by what you own as a capital investment, and as you kind of move forward. But as I say, the key thing for me is connectivity. If you haven't got connectivity, you haven't got anything. So with an OB truck, effectively you take your own connectivity on site, and you kind of have a satellite, and you just think about it like that. But all of these things are moving so fast now that it's possible to bring back 50 cameras from an NFL game into a centralized production system. I think there's also difference depending on the territory you are. So if you're in the US, you've got one big country with games happening right across the country, and you're trying to cover that, and therefore shipping a truck from the East Coast to the West Coast is so you've got to have dual assets, and all that kind of stuff is really complicated. In Europe, obviously, we've got lots of smaller states and federations, so it's less problematic to do localized productions, because you've probably got an OB truck within 200 miles of where the event is. But there's still a lot of times where we see these big global events, World Cups, Olympics, just two that we've got this year, and then virtually these things happen every year now. So there's just this iteration of innovation that happens.
From the standards point of view, and to answer your questions about best practices, there is a real effort to establish those. As a matter of fact, AMWA has, 4 or 5 different specifications that are labeled best practice this, best practice that. They exist. In the BSF organization, we also have some of those. But like Ian says, they're silos. They're, the different parts. We're looking at those very well, making them work well, but they don't talk to each other right now. And with some simple enhancements to specifications from both sides, we can have a bridge between them that would end up this kind of non-interoperable chaos of REMI that we have today.
And I think that's the exciting thing about the work that's going on in the AMWA and EBU work on the Joint Task Force on network. Get it wrong. Joint Task Force on Dynamic Media Facilities. It really is looking at everything from business problems through to interoperable ways we work, and then building on some of the technologies we've seen accelerate really fast over the past year, like MXL.
How can I'm thinking about that, not having to have a lot of infrastructure, not having to make big capital investments, that using things like cloud-based production could be really helpful for smaller companies or more agile companies, although I guess you have your cloud bill ticking over all the time. But you see that as being, could it be a big boost for small broadcasters, local news organizations? Or is it, are you able to really do that stuff with existing tech anyway?
Depends what you want to do. Like I say, if you just want to run, bring 3 or 4 sources in, run them in a software-based vision mixer on a local PC, yeah, that's possible. But when you want to do things at scale, that becomes increasingly challenging. So, I think there's one fundamental big problem with the cloud that we talk about quite a lot, which is actually there's a significant cost to bringing media in, getting it out, storing it. There's a little bit of a pushback, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, about actually more and more people moving to on-prem, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they just want to work in COTS, but they still want the same architecture. We've learned that the cloud architecture is around shared memory across hosts, around containerized applications, around microservices, is a really good architecture. And that's also where a lot of the talent are coming in and coming out of universities who understand that kind of architecture. So we can still architect our workflows in that way. We just need to choose whether we want the cost of running them on the cloud or we run them on our own environment, and then sort of push out to the cloud when we're at capacity around larger events, or however you want to operate. So I think this hybrid model is where we are, and we're going to be there for a very long time. Whether the kind of hyperscalers will, some of them will sort of grow and grow, but I do think more of the actual owning of the infrastructure may change.
I think there's also a misconception of what cloud really means on hybrid workflows, right? Because Ian, you described a cloud where only the big players are the ones that can give you the service, right? The ones that have gigantic infrastructure that can scale from 1 to 1 million users if you need to. But that's not the reality of most of REMI. In the case of REMI, you have a limited number of cameras, flows, streams, go from point A to point B. You can spin up a bare metal machine on another cloud that doesn't belong to the big ones for $100 a month and have enough bandwidth and bare metal to do everything you want. So the cost is not an issue. The issue that we have right now is people don't know how to do it. There's not enough talent, especially in the small companies, which are the ones that need it the most. They don't have people that can stitch this together, that can make this work, that are taught from universities, from whatever it is, on how to leverage the thousands of data centers ready to give you service, where you can actually put some software in there and run your own REMI for nothing, for pennies.
But there's challenges around that as well. I mean, I was with one of our customers yesterday who does remote production. That's their core business, but they've got an SDI infrastructure and they're at capacity on that. And their kind of question is, okay, well, do I make a decision to go down an IP workflow, or do I kind of think about going into a software workflow? And if I go into a software workflow, well, what does that, where do I host that? How do I do that? They don't get the same discounts as large broadcasters do on cloud services. So quite often, if you're a large broadcaster, you might have a special deal with one of the hyperscalers. But often you'll farm out your actual production work to another company who doesn't have that same thing. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there aren't still hybrid workflows that go on with that, and even things like contribution feeds of world feeds that are coming out from a traditionally produced, I'll call them outside broadcast, but that traditional workflow will be via the internet somehow more and more these days. And that's where Rist and SRT are really starting to sort of change, really have changed the game in the past 5 years. Just that acceptance, actually, the internet's good enough.
So what about how does AI fit into all this? Because I know there's a lot of, and I use that big AI word, with some caution, because it can mean a bunch of different things to different people. But I know that like automation is something that's integrated into some products and some tech, being able to, whether it's operate cameras remotely using machine learning, or be able to automate different control room processes. What is your sense of like what is happening with AI tools now and where they might go? And is it a lot of trying to fix problems with a little AI magic that maybe need to be fixed before you add the AI, or what's your take?
AI is great. yeah, there's lots of things that we can do with it, but it's just kind of fast compute processing in my mind. So there's a lot of things that get badged with AI that, it's just the computers are now powerful enough to do stuff. So let's take a few examples. There are kind of practical editorial things you can do with AI, maybe things like shot logging or data management or a whole bunch of things that you can do to make finding content easier. There's a whole bunch of things that we may do. You mentioned orchestration, automation, and things like that. I can see a world where I'll just go onto a website and say, provision me a 5-camera OB, and it'll build that, and it will, put in the place the licenses and stuff like that. The problem with that is that we talk about orchestration and automation as one thing, but it's different because you might need a network orchestration that's going to provision your network layer, and then you might need another thing that's actually going to bring in your media functions, and then another thing that's going to manage your UI. So you've got all these different orchestration layers. So we need to be able to, as a manufacturer, we need to be able to provide the right control that either a human or an AI, it doesn't really matter which one, can get in and provision the equipment. And then we've got AI monitoring. And I think that's where it gets really interesting for remote production, because we're now able to analyze a stream and really look in at the detail of the stream and where things are going wrong and really just identify things live. So up until this point, if you get a signal breakup, you'll switch to your backup stream, and then you'll go into the post-mortem, after the event, and you'll go, yeah, we lost the A leg. And they go, well, why? We don't know. We've got no idea, because nobody's logging that at the time, because it's just the most important thing is to stay on air. Now we can have engines that are kind of constantly monitoring the performance of the codecs, the performance of the underlying infrastructure that's transporting that, give us instant feedback on where those things are going, and then give us kind of more control and understanding of instant feedback and almost predict problems. So I think there's a lot of potential in that side of things.
Yeah, you often
Sure.
see, especially in the Rist area, somebody running a stream and having 6-7 graphs with, as a function of trying to figure out what's going on and monitoring. And it's a lot of data to process, and that's where AI shines, right? They can in real time look at all those graphs, all that data, and tell you, hey, this link is getting saturated. Maybe we should do A and B before we go off air. That type of thing. Another simple example of AI, which I loved, I saw a PTC camera that had a simple AI engine that would follow you around. You're on stage, and you have this PTC, no operator, follows you around.
So I think that's very important when we talk about sort of democratization of things. So it's really easy to talk about the big leagues and the big sports, but there's a whole bunch of other things. I've just been at a conference where people were talking about pool tournaments and 9-ball pool and things like that, and there's more and more demand for that content, and we've got to produce that somehow, and therefore there will be engines that enable that, and particularly sport is very rules based. Most sports have rules, and you kind of can predict what happens in, there's always that bit of jeopardy if something happens outside of those rules, but you can be pretty certain, where what's going to happen next. And therefore that's another thing that's relatively easy to predict in terms of automation and stuff like that.
And I guess that being able to sort of say, produce something remotely, and there's somebody on site who's maybe no technical people on site, but you can say, all right, set up a camera. And, we're able to get a feed from your iPhone into our system, whatever it is we're using, and then we'll take it all from here, potentially, and then there's very degrees of that, but it could mean that you would be able to cover news or sports or things where potentially nobody on the scene is even.
Yeah, I think we see examples of that all the time. It's I've been involved in this side of things since mobile phones could first do video, and everyone says user generated content is the future. I think the reality is, people value the editorial input and the large cameras and stuff like that. So just putting 100 iPhones at a soccer game is not going to improve the coverage. You still want that kind of directed, curated coverage, but equally well, like I say, there are rules on how we set up cameras at a soccer game. There are, particular shots that you go for. You kind of know if the ball's moving in one direction, what the direction of travel is. There are things that you can do in that space that are achievable, but you're probably not going to want to do it on your big flagship events.
Mm.
But analytics, I think, is really important. Being able to take sort of those broadcast feeds and then the governing bodies. And what's really interesting, again, remote, is more and more sports governing bodies are bringing production in-house using remote models because they want to own the content, they want to own the have access to it for more social media, more analytical stuff and things like that. So we're seeing a kind of shift perhaps from, rights holding sports governing bodies sort of just letting the broadcasters produce telly and then charging them for the broadcast rights on that, to them actually wanted to produce and own that content.
So I guess looking ahead, like you said that there are a few things that probably need to be ironed out. But I mean, do you see things being radically different in 5 years, or is it really just kind of ironing out some of the wrinkles we have now?
I envision, the having an interoperable standard for REMI and an orchestration layer that, everybody can agree on, so that we don't have as many silos of vendor-specific solutions, especially when trying to, bridge the internet and bring a stream from point A to point B, or bouncing it off a cloud. From my point of view, I would like to see also, like you said, democratization of these services, so that not only the companies that can afford AWS use it, right? There's so many possibilities of all the types of REMI that are not happening because of it, that I hope we get there in 5 years.
I mean, fundamentally, I think the way we produce content, it's linear signals in, it's probably asynchronous stuff in the middle, and then it's linear out, and so we're always going to have a hybrid model by design. I think what we'll see is this shift from hardware centric to software centric to more and more challenges coming along some of them aren't just technology changes. Some of them are really, as I said earlier, business challenges. How do you license? People want pay-per-use licenses, but that doesn't always necessarily work for, if you've got there's a cost to producing software, and so vendors need to sort of recover that cost and do things, whereas there's a tension with people just wanting to pay for stuff as they're using it. So how do we resolve that? There's questions about how do we manage software that's running on different environments and kind of move between different hosts and different environments. But all of these things are solvable and have been solved by other industries. So we just need to kind of, in some ways, grow up as a broadcast industry and stop thinking that we're super special. We used to be, because we needed that bandwidth, but the reality is now bandwidth and compute power is more than capable of doing what we do. So now's the right time to really start pushing in that direction. Up until now, I think we've almost been held back because our requirements have been so demanding that it's not been achievable. But we're seeing more and more people just proving that wrong now.
Yeah, we've also seen the gap between broadcast and Pro AV closing to a point where you cannot tell the difference anymore. When one type of production versus the other.
Yeah, if I was going to change? I think one thing it'd probably be not thinking about legacy broadcast workflows and things that stop us being innovative. So fractional frame rates. We do fractional frame rates because we've got a legacy transmission system, and actually that if everything's on the internet, then let's just work at sensible integer frame rates, because the maths is easier. The whole thing is just so much simpler. We can work at 60.
What about
interlaced? Interlaced should have gone ages ago.
Why doesn't it exist today?
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of legacy that we're just clinging on to that actually somebody just needs to be brave enough and go, what, I'm producing this for, the web is now on my first client, and TV is a little bit secondary, and it's not that hard to do a frame rate conversion on my 60p content for the TV rather than the other way around.
Right.
Well, I wondered also how that, and maybe this is a question for how vendors can work together, because just it's in the word distributed broadcasts. That means that different disparate areas of the globe, really literally, can be working together on a broadcast that might not have had any connection previously. You can have a team that's in uh, in another continent, and I can form a relationship with them for whatever reason. Maybe it's we're doing news, or we're doing sports, or it could be anything in terms of live broadcast and those collaborations. So I wonder what that invites in terms of those collaborations among different broadcasters who may be very different ways of doing things, and then also vendors and how vendors work together that might not have been exposed to each other before. It kind of brings up that standards question, but I think there's also something bigger about, like, how do you find ways of learning and working with each other?
So I think the broadcasters have always been really good at it because they're all trying to solve the same problem. And you go to an IBC, the Olympics or a World Cup, and everyone's in the same boat. They're all sort of talking, looking at how people have done it, and sharing ideas and putting those demands out there. On the vendor side, there's always been that competition about our product is best. But what we've seen recently, particularly around things like MXL, is actually vendors coming together, going, actually, look, the great thing about SDI, as Sergio said earlier, is a standard that everyone had, and I could be pretty certain that if I took an SDI, let's ignore level A, level B stuff for now, but if I took an SDI out from one box and plug it into another, it was just going to work. And we've kind of lost that a little bit in some instances. We've got to have this interoperable layer, and I think what MXL has done is it's just said, right, hang on a minute, let's have an interoperable, understood set of specifications that we can all work to. Now, they might not be what we're doing internally within our product, but it does enable me to bring content into from our software product and send it over to somebody else who's a graphics engine or a replay engine or something like that, without having to pay the penalty of a re-encode, transcode, transport stream thing. I can just move stuff from compute to compute. And I think that's going to be a game changer. But that's just one thing in this whole stack of other things we need to worry about as we move into
right, because MXL solves a very important problem, but it's still an uncompressed format. So it's still only going to work within that compute module that you have. Yeah, it's great. Let's all share this. What happens when we want to move it across the internet or to another place? How do we compress it? What do we use?
But that's the same problem we got with SDI. SDI is effectively an uncompressed format, but if I'm running it in a gallery or in one location, I've got SDI. But if I want to move it somewhere else, I've got to put it on a transport stream.
So maybe MXL can replace SDI that refuses to die.
I'm not going to be the person who says that. But yeah, I mean, we've got to understand our architectures, rethink how we do things as we move from into distributed production. There are things in the compute world like RDMA and all of those things that will enable us to do more of that. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that you'll have a compute at a location with uncompressed 50 uncompressed streams coming in that you'll shift over memory exchange to a host out the back. Now, maybe if I look back on this in 50 years, that may be possible, but the reality is now that you're still going to have that compression. But if we, MXL is only uncompressed because that's what we've agreed to do in stage one. There is no reason that, if we all agree we're going to share a particular codec, you could still share that. It's just data, yeah? So there's no reason we couldn't at some point in the future have compressed MXL as well. It's just that's what we've chosen to do first.
Amazing. Well, I think that may wrap it up for us now. But we've done our own remote broadcast here, along with so many other podcasters around the world. But it's I think it's a fascinating topic because it really does mean that I could do a broadcast in partnership with somebody anywhere in the world, and that leads to, I think, more connection and more information getting to more people, and I think it's really something pretty amazing that if you told somebody 50 years ago, they would be thrilled and shocked. But yeah, thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Ian, and we hope we can talk to you again in the future at Feed Forum. and make sure you at home stay subscribed to Feed so you get more great content like this. Thanks very much.